The call came just after lunch, right as I was staring out of the 20th floor window of Echelon Global's Midtown office, watching the world churn beneath me. The traffic, the people, the ceaseless motion of a city that never stops to consider who just lost their footing. I thought it might be Brielle checking in about dinner plans or maybe dropping a hint about where she wanted to go for our anniversary, some new place with sculpted plates and 12-course menus that charged extra for air. But when I answered, I heard it in her voice before she even spoke. The smirk. "We're downsizing," she said, sharp and breezy, like she was commenting on the weather. "Today's your last day, unless you want to stay on as janitor. Floors need mopping." Behind her, I heard Myra's unmistakable cackle. Cold. Cruel. Loud enough that she wanted me to hear. That meant it wasn't just business. It was personal. My wife's sister had hated me since the day I stopped paying for her Pilates classes and called her out for borrowing one of Brielle's business cards to expense a vacation. She was the type who smiled at funerals, mostly to check out who was grieving harder than her. I stared at the skyline, forcing my voice to stay even. "Thanks for the amazing offer." Brielle laughed like she'd won something. And maybe she thought she had. In her mind, it was probably some final blow. After all, she was the queen now. CEO of a global firm, wearing tailored power suits and clinking glasses with venture capitalists who didn't care what lives they steamrolled. She had the title, the spotlight, the nameplate on the mahogany door, and apparently enough pettiness to fire her own husband like an intern with poor hygiene. But she didn't know what I knew. She didn't know about the fallback plan I'd been nurturing like a quiet ember in the back of my mind for months. She didn't know about the private studio apartment I kept across town, the one where I did my real work, the kind of work Echelon ran on, the kind of work she paraded around as hers in board meetings. She didn't know that while she was busy stepping over people to pose for glossy magazine interviews, I was building something no publicist could spin, no press release could capture. And she sure as hell didn't know that the reason she could even hold her head high in those shareholder meetings was because of the predictive analytics engine I'd coded, refined, and perfected. An engine that was never formally transferred to Echelon in any signed document. It lived in their systems, but it had my fingerprint all over it. And now, I was the only one who could truly navigate its core without capsizing the entire ship. I wouldn't bother coming home either, Brielle added casually. "We've changed the locks." Myra said it was time. She didn't hang up immediately. She waited. Like she wanted to hear me crack, to scream or beg or lash out with the kind of desperation that would prove her superiority. But I didn't give her that. I never had. That was part of what made her hate me toward the end. I didn't need her money, and that was an unforgivable crime in Brielle's world. So I simply said, "You've made yourself very clear," and hung up. I sat there for a moment longer, breathing through the silence that followed. The office around me was quiet. Too quiet. As if the building had been instructed to shun me in real time. The digital clock on the corner of my desk kept blinking 12:53. My hands were still on the phone. But inside, something had shifted. I stood up and looked around. The desk I'd once cherished was now just another hollow space with a surface littered with memos, deadlines, and empty coffee cups that symbolized wasted hours. A framed photo of us, Brielle and me, smiling at Lake Como 2 years ago, sat near my monitor. I picked it up, held it for half a second, and then flipped it face down. Let them think they'd humiliated me. The truth? They'd just opened the gate. I took one last glance around my office. No speeches. No long email goodbyes. I didn't need to broadcast what I already knew. The version of me they thought they were firing wasn't the man who was walking out of here. The real me had been sitting dormant, quiet in the corners, waiting. And now, he was wide awake. I slid my phone into my coat pocket, picked up my laptop, and opened one specific folder, one that only I could access with a biometric key I'd coded myself. A heartbeat sensor tied to my Apple Watch, a redundancy system that bypassed firewalls, and a self-erasing algorithm if anyone but me touched it. I smiled at the screen. It still worked. Then I deleted it. The core script. The untraceable, original kernel of the analytics system that powered every major decision Echelon made. The framework still existed on their servers, but without this piece, it would slowly become inaccurate, then unreliable, then useless. A digital time bomb. It wouldn't explode immediately. It would unravel. A 0.25% missed here, a projected growth curve that didn't match results, a partner who lost confidence after one too many wrong data points. No one would know exactly what went wrong, but I would. I closed the laptop, slid it into its sleeve, and picked up the only other thing I cared about in the room, a small, leather-bound notebook tucked inside a locked drawer. My notes, my plans, my freedom. As I walked down the hallway, no one looked at me. The receptionist averted her eyes. The HR manager I used to help prep presentations suddenly found her phone very interesting. But one person did meet my gaze. Damon, a junior analyst I'd mentored since his first internship. He stood at the corner, eyes wide, confusion and sadness written all over his face. I gave him a small nod. He nodded back. That was enough. In the elevator, I finally exhaled. I was free. And Brielle? She thought she'd played the final card. But the game had only just begun. The doors slid open with a quiet hiss, and I stepped into the marble-floored lobby of Echelon Global for what would be the last time. Not that anyone would have guessed. I wasn't dragging a box of personal effects. I wasn't red-faced or weeping into my tie. No storming. No dramatic outburst. Just a quiet walk toward the end of something I had helped build with my bare hands and better intentions. The silence in that lobby was a language of its own. Subtle, suffocating. The receptionist, Marcy, looked up from her desk. Her hand hovered mid-air over the keyboard, then quickly dropped as if she hadn't seen me, as if ignoring me might undo the moment. I didn't blame her. She was just another foot soldier trying not to step on landmines. Word must have traveled fast, eh? Brielle's empire was efficient like that. She didn't just fire people. She erased them. Clean breaks, no fingerprints. I'm sure by now, the official story was that I'd stepped down to pursue creative interests. I could practically hear her PR team polishing the statement. I took my time walking past the glass panels that lined the hallway. Through them, I saw bits and pieces of a world I once cared about. Rooms where I'd brainstormed late into the night, crunched numbers that no one else could decode, and coded entire systems that had become the lifeblood of the company. People looked up from their desks curious. I saw a few stiffen. A few ducked their heads. One or two offered tentative nods. There was no spoken farewell. But I saw something else in their eyes. Not pity, no. Something more rattling. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of what this meant. If I could be discarded, someone who'd once shared the corner office with the Queen herself, what did that say about their own security? Their own worth? I didn't slow down. I turned right into the elevator vestibule, past the break room, where someone had left behind half a donut on a paper towel. Strange what your brain picks up when everything's ending. I pressed the button and waited, hearing the soft whirring of cables behind the walls. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Fast, then hesitant. I didn't turn around until a voice spoke. Mason. I turned. Damon. The junior analyst I'd mentored. Smart. Observant. Loyal in a way I hadn't expected anyone to be in that building anymore. His tie was slightly askew, and his brow was creased with concern. I just heard, he said. Is it true? I offered a small smile. Define true. He looked stunned for a moment. You're really leaving? I was invited to mop floors, I said dryly. But I declined the promotion. He laughed nervously, not sure if it was a joke or not. He stepped closer, voice lowered. This doesn't feel right. You are Echelon. Everyone knows that, even if they won't say it out loud. I'm not Echelon, I said quietly. Not anymore. The elevator chimed. The doors opened. I stepped inside, then turned to him as he hovered, unsure whether to follow or stay behind. I could see it in his eyes, questions he wanted to ask but didn't have the courage to voice. Not yet. If I were you, I said gently, I'd start polishing my resume. Sooner rather than later. He nodded once. It wasn't just gratitude. It was understanding. The doors closed. Down I went, each floor a small exhale, a memory passing. The late-night pizza sessions. The strategic planning meetings that turned into marital arguments behind closed doors. The celebratory drinks after quarterly wins where Brielle toasted the team and I smiled quietly, knowing the engine behind the numbers was sitting in my hard drive. By the time the elevator reached the ground floor, I had shed every layer of pride I'd once tied to that place. My nameplate was already gone, my keycard disabled, but I didn't feel powerless. I felt lighter. Outside, the city hadn't changed. The sidewalks still pulsed with urgency. Horns blared. Tourists snapped photos near the fountains. I stood on the curb with my laptop case slung over my shoulder and my coat collar turned up against the early wind. I didn't call a car. I walked. Not aimlessly, deliberately. 8 blocks later, I reached the Echelon data center. A nondescript building wrapped in slate gray panels and obscured behind code-locked doors. I still had one last credential, an analog one. The security guard, an older man named Lester who'd once shared stories about his daughter's softball games, looked up from his newspaper. "Hey, Mr. Mason, didn't know you were stopping by today?" "Just grabbing a few old backups," I said with an easy grin. He shrugged and buzzed me through. Inside the server room, I moved quickly. No hesitation. I went straight to Terminal C, an old console only a few of us ever used. I plugged in my encrypted flash drive, bypassed the front-facing protocols, and navigated to a buried data cache. Not just files, architecture, frameworks, logs that told stories Brielle never even knew were being written. I didn't take them. I didn't need to. I simply deleted one very specific decryption script, a private key that validated thousands of real-time transactions between Echelon and its AI recommendation engine. It would take them weeks to realize what was wrong. By then, clients would start losing trust. Decision metrics would start faltering. And it would all trace back to a ghost script, one I had just erased. I removed the flash drive, wiped the terminal's cache, and left. Outside, the clouds had thickened. A light drizzle kissed the top of my head. I didn't rush. I took the subway downtown, to the studio apartment Brielle never knew existed. A 400-square-foot space tucked above a bookstore, with peeling paint and bad insulation, but privacy no one could touch. Inside, I took off my coat, dropped my bag, and opened a drawer in the corner desk. There it was, the black notebook. Not a journal, not memories, blueprints, plans, codes, names, concepts. It was the foundation of everything I never shared, never trusted anyone with, not even Brielle. Especially not her. I sat down, flipped to the last page I'd written on, and picked up the pen that had been waiting for this moment. They thought they'd humiliated me. Truth was, they'd set me free. The studio apartment was nothing special to anyone else, a narrow room tucked above a bookstore, with creaky floorboards, chipped molding, and a radiator that hissed like it was in constant protest. But to me, it was sanctuary. Freedom. The one place left that was mine and mine alone. No keycard access, no security cameras, no boardroom eyes tracking my every move. Brielle had never stepped foot here. Hell, she didn't even know it existed, which made it the most valuable real estate I had. I kicked off my shoes, tossed my coat over the sagging arm of a worn leather chair, and walked to the desk in the corner, the one that looked like it belonged in a hacker's lair more than an ex-executive's safe house. I slid open the bottom drawer, fingers brushing past a stack of prepaid SIM cards and USB drives until they landed on the black notebook. It wasn't labeled. No names. No logos. Just matte leather and thread binding worn from constant flipping. This notebook wasn't just a backup. It was the real master key. My insurance. I opened it slowly, like a ritual, and the pages bloomed with diagrams, equations, and notes scrawled in tiny, precise handwriting. Charts mapping Echelon's core algorithms. Frameworks I'd coded by hand over the last 5 years. Adjustments no one else could even begin to interpret. Every line of logic, every predictive model that powered their proprietary engine, they all started here. With me. Brielle never asked how the engine worked. Never asked about rights or authorship. Why would she? I was her husband. The man in the shadows who made the magic happen so she could take center stage. She'd been too busy dressing up our story for investors to worry about the fine print. The irony was poetic. She built a fortress on sand and never once stopped to test the ground beneath her heels. And now, I had a choice. I could destroy Echelon from the outside with a single coordinated leak. A few emails, a handful of internal documents, and a demo of how unstable their projections were without my code would be enough to trigger an internal audit and a public relations disaster. But that wasn't what I wanted. Revenge wasn't the point. Not really. I wanted to build something better. I flipped to the tab section marked Nova. That was the code name I'd given to the project, the one I'd been sketching out in the stolen hours between midnight and dawn, long before Brielle ever picked up her first investor. Nova wasn't just another analytics tool. It was the next generation. A self-learning, ethics-compliant intelligence engine that adjusted its projections based not only on market behavior, but on sentiment, socioeconomic variance, and individual context. Something more human. I ran a hand through my hair and pulled my laptop onto the desk. No Echelon servers. No dependencies. This system lived locally. I powered it up and watched the Nova interface bloom across the screen. Smooth, clean, elegant. The login screen pulsed gently. I tapped in my credentials and was greeted with a quiet chime. "Welcome back, Mason." 3 new messages blinked in the corner of the dashboard. I clicked through them. The first was from a hedge fund in Singapore that had heard whispers about a new black box product being quietly tested among independent VCs. The second was a meeting request from an executive at Hyperion DataWorks, a former Echelon client I suspected would be very interested in what Nova could offer. And the third was from someone unexpected, Alton Morrow, CEO of Luminar Ventures, a man who'd once called me a quiet genius during a panel discussion on the future of AI in business. He was one of the few people who saw me, not just the public version of me Brielle used like a trophy husband, but the actual thinker behind the curtain. The message was simple. Heard what happened. If you're ready to build, we should talk. Coffee? My office. No suits, no games. You pick the day. I stared at the message for a long moment, then opened a tab and looked at the calendar. This wasn't luck. It was alignment. A signal that the path I'd drawn wasn't a fantasy. It was real. Achievable. I stood and walked to the window. The city stretched before me, sprawling and indifferent, lit up like a living organism. Somewhere in that maze of steel and light, Brielle was probably sipping champagne with Myra, celebrating their little coup. Maybe she thought I was crying in a hotel lobby or begging some attorney for a bridge loan. Let her think that. I sipped cold coffee left from earlier that morning and returned to my desk. I started assembling a folder. Not just code vision. A roadmap. What Nova could do, what it would cost, who it could serve, and how it would redefine what data intelligence meant in the next 5 years. This wasn't just about proving I could survive without her. It was about proving I was always the one driving the engine. By midnight, the outline was complete. I packaged the folder into an encrypted file and set up a meeting invite for Alton Morrow Tuesday at 9:30 a.m. No suits, no games, just 2 people who understood the battlefield. I stared at the invite for a moment before hitting send. Then I leaned back, arms behind my head, letting the tension ease out of my spine. The world had shifted, but I hadn't collapsed under it. In fact, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. Not because I had a team behind me or a corporation cushioning my fall, but because I had clarity. Brielle thought she'd cut me off from everything that mattered. What she'd really done was hand me the match while standing in a house of paper. The real work began now. And this time, the empire I built wouldn't have her name anywhere near it. Alton Morrow didn't do small talk. That was the first thing anyone in the tech space learned when they crossed his path. He was blunt, unfiltered, and terrifyingly intelligent. The kind of man who made power moves in jeans and loafers, who could glance at a dashboard and know which direction the market would lurch 3 quarters from now. If Brielle was the queen of flash and posturing, Alton was the architect of substance. That's why I picked him. I didn't make an appointment. I didn't send an email. I just showed up. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Kyla, raised an eyebrow when I walked into the glass-paneled reception area of Luminar Ventures, holding nothing but a black thumb drive in my palm and a look that said I wasn't here to beg. She looked me over, then picked up her phone and whispered something. A beat later, she nodded once and pointed down the hall. He said clear his schedule. Go on in. Alton's office wasn't showy. No marble, no abstract art hung, just to impress. Just a long window view of the skyline and a single desk, steel, clean, precise. The man himself was leaning against the window frame, sleeves rolled up, a ceramic mug in one hand, and a faint smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. I figured you'd come eventually, he said, voice low and cool. Didn't think it'd be this soon. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and held up the thumb drive like an offering. I've got something to show you. No strings. Just facts. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Then show me. I plugged in the drive, opened the encrypted folder, and let Nova speak for itself. First, the framework, an interface that visualized behavior patterns not just by raw data points, but by emotional resonance, sociopolitical context, and trust weighting. Then the model's self-correcting engine, coded to recognize its own blind spots and retrain in real time without human prompt. Finally, the projection module, how Nova could forecast market shifts not just based on metrics, but by anticipating human decision patterns days, even weeks, ahead. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions. He just watched, eyes sharp and unwavering. When the final module closed, he leaned back and whistled. You built this. Every line of code, I said. And you're telling me this didn't come from Echelon? I never signed over IP rights, I replied. Everything they use is a shadow of this. A half-baked version built off my early drafts. He tilted his head. And Brielle? She doesn't know. She thinks she burned the bridge, I said. But she forgot I built the river first. He let that hang in the air for a long moment. Then he smiled, just enough to show teeth. You could break them. I met his gaze. I could build something better. He nodded slowly. Now that's a better game. Alton stood and circled around the desk, hands in his pockets. You know, when I first met you, you were the guy standing behind her at those expos, adjusting her mic, watching the screens. Quiet, polite. She called you her support system. Said you were brilliant, but not business-minded. She never minded my mind when it paid for her first office lease. I said, voice calm. Alton chuckled. Well, she's about to learn the hard way what happens when the support system goes solo. He sat on the edge of the desk. Let's talk about rollout. About funding. I've got a team of engineers who can work in a blackout zone. A legal department that can draw circles around her before she even gets out of bed. And I've got capital, Mason. Real capital. I nodded. I want autonomy. No shadow control. I'm not handing over another brainchild to someone else's ego. You won't, he said. You'll be the face this time. And the hands. And the spine. I exhaled slowly. Then we moved now. We talked for 2 more hours. About strategy, about deployment, about how to build something that wasn't just a reaction to Echelon, but a complete paradigm shift. Not a clone. Not a copy. A challenger. One rooted in everything Echelon had lost. Real trust, real transparency, real ingenuity. By the time I left his office, the sun had dipped below the skyline. The city was shifting into its twilight rhythm, but I walked differently now. No longer as the discarded husband Brielle thought she'd exiled, but as the man who had built the bones of an empire and was now drafting something stronger from scratch. Outside the building, I paused under a flickering street lamp, the air sharp with the smell of rain and ambition. I pulled out my phone and opened an old folder of Echelon press clippings, photos of Brielle at launches, in panel discussions, in luxury hotels giving statements about innovation and legacy. Always her name. Always her smile. My fingerprints hidden behind the velvet curtain. Not anymore. I tapped the screen and started a new document. A list of names. Engineers, analysts, strategists. People I had mentored, collaborated with, or quietly supported behind the scenes, many of them now disillusioned or outright discarded by Echelon. The cast-offs. The ignored. The ones who built the foundation but were never invited to the top floor. They'd be the first ones I called. They knew the truth. And they were hungry to build again with someone who saw them. I walked 2 blocks to a late-night diner, ordered coffee, and opened my laptop right there under the buzz of cheap lights and old vinyl booths. The Nova framework was already humming. I pulled up a new interface and began outlining what we'd need for Phase 1. Server load testing, private beta clients, legal architecture for ownership and release rights. I didn't need to destroy Brielle to win. All I had to do was give people something real to believe in. Something she could never offer. Something I'd always held in my hands. It was easy to forget how many people Brielle had discarded on her way up. She wore ambition like armor, sharp and shining, and she didn't mind stepping over bodies to get to the next stage. But the thing about discarded people is, they remember. They talk. And when someone finally shows up with a different kind of plan, one that doesn't involve egos and power plays but respect and opportunity, they show up too. My mornings started early now. No corporate commute, no tailored suits or sterile boardrooms. Just black coffee, a plain t-shirt, and a whiteboard already littered with diagrams and timelines before the sun fully rose. The studio apartment transformed overnight into a nerve center. Cables snaked across the floor, laptops hummed with simulations, and empty takeout boxes were stacked like trophies. It was messy. It was human. It was real. And it was working. Within days of my meeting with Alton, things began to move. Not in the flashy, PR-heavy way Echelon liked to operate, but in a way that had weight. Quiet meetings in co-working spaces. Midnight video calls with engineers in Berlin, Toronto, Sao Paulo. People I had once worked beside in the trenches, now eager to join a movement instead of a machine. They were tired of being cogs. I gave them keys. Nova was no longer just a concept. It was breathing, learning, iterating. Every day we added new layers. A modular trust algorithm. A consumer-side transparency panel that would let clients see exactly how their data was used. No more black box. No more guesswork. If Echelon was flash and illusion, Nova would be fire and glass, bright, hot, and impossible to fake. But building the engine was only one part of it. I needed people, not just programmers and coders, but storytellers, strategists, people who could see past the numbers and understand what Nova meant for the world. That's when I called Marin. She had once been Echelon's lead UX designer, until Brielle sidelined her in a reorg that replaced talent with trend chasers. Marin had an instinct for experience, a sixth sense for what users needed before they could articulate it. I sent her a simple message: "Let me show you something worth believing in." She replied with 3 words: "Send the address." When she arrived, her eyes scanned the chaos of my apartment turn lab, and instead of flinching, she grinned. "Looks like you're actually doing it." I nodded. "Want to help build something better?" Marin rolled up her sleeves and joined without a second question. One by one, they came. People Brielle had pushed aside, bought out, or overlooked. Not because they weren't talented, but because they made the mistake of not worshiping her. We called ourselves Project Lantern, because we weren't here to burn bridges or burn down old empires. We were here to illuminate the path forward. By the 3rd week, I had 15 full-time team members and 3 venture meetings scheduled. Alton stayed hands-off, just as he promised, but I felt his support in the rooms he opened and the names he whispered in the right ears. Still, it wasn't just about the launch or the product. There was a deeper satisfaction in reclaiming something that had once been mine: my voice, my identity, my damn name. I started reaching out to former Echelon clients, not to poach, but to explain. Some didn't pick up. Some listened, curious but hesitant. But a few asked questions. The right ones. And I answered with clarity, without bitterness, and backed by facts. I showed them what Echelon's predictive system had been doing over the last 6 months, how its accuracy was declining, how it was recommending suboptimal targets, how the very algorithm they trusted was degrading from the inside. And then I showed them Nova. Not the full system, just enough to make their eyes widen. A prototype demo, real-time sentiment mapping, ethical guardrails that could be audited. One exec, a woman named Cassie from a major retail platform, leaned forward after a 30-minute Zoom and said, "Mason, this is going to change everything. When can I get on the beta list?" I didn't need 1,000,000 customers. I needed 10 who believed in what we were doing. But even as we built upward, I couldn't ignore the past. Not because I was stuck in it, but because it still had my fingerprints all over it. So I made an appointment with a law firm Alton's people recommended. I walked in with my notebook, my laptop, and my thumb drive. I left with something much more valuable: a fully registered patent, my name, my code, time-stamped, ironclad. I didn't rush to use it. I didn't run to the press. That was Brielle's style. I tucked it away, quiet, ready, because I knew the time was coming. While I met with engineers and brainstormed UI frameworks with Marin, I kept an ear to the ground. I saw the whispers online, forums where developers discussed how Echelon's output was acting weird or not matching the model accuracy anymore. I watched as minor influencers, the kind Echelon used to pride themselves on swaying, began to talk about other options. New players, open systems, better data ethics. Brielle was still doing interviews, still hosting her champagne mixers, still laughing on stages in her silk dresses and buzzwords. But underneath it all, I could see the cracks forming. That's what happens when you build a throne on people's backs and forget that one day, they might all stand up. One night, around 2 a.m., I was sitting on my windowsill, nursing the last of my coffee, when Meyer's name popped up in a news alert. Echelon expands into wearable data tracking. Privacy concerns raised by tech watchdogs. I laughed out loud, because of course they were doubling down on invasion disguised as innovation. But it was coming. Soon, she'd be sitting at a table she didn't even realize I'd set. Soon, she'd see that the man she thought she erased had never stopped writing. He just picked a better pen, and it would be my signature, mine, that marked the beginning of her end. The conference room was all sharp lines and silence. Glass walls, chrome finishes, matte black leather chairs spaced around a sleek obsidian table that looked like it belonged in a Bond villain's lair. It didn't smell like money, it reeked of it. Fresh cut wood. Espresso. Some subtle cologne engineered to convey dominance. I'd been in rooms like this before, but always beside Brielle. Never across from her. Never opposite. Today was different. 12 people sat at that table, men and women who could write 8-figure checks without blinking. They didn't come for pleasantries. They came for vision. for opportunity, for power. And I had all three. At the head of the table, I stood beside Alton Morrow, who introduced me not as former Echelon executive or tech architect, but simply the man building the future. He knew what he was doing. Words matter in rooms like these. He didn't want them seeing me as Brielle's shadow. He wanted them to see me as the light. A presentation played behind us. Marin's design, simple, bold, elegant. Nova's interface moved like liquid glass across the screen, cycling through demo slides, real-time trust metrics, adaptive behavior models, full transparency audits. I didn't pitch like Brielle used to. No buzzwords, no ego, no pretense. I told the truth. We're not selling you a product, I said. We're offering you a foundation. The systems most of you currently use are aging beneath the surface. They're brittle. They're optimized for performance metrics that are outdated before the quarter ends. Nova isn't just predictive, it's perceptive. It's built to understand behavior as it happens, not after the fact. They leaned in. Some nodded. One jotted something in a leather notebook. Then the doors opened, and the air shifted. The click of heels. Confident. Sharp. Measured. Brielle, draped in navy blue silk, jaw locked tight, lips pressed into a blade of a smile. Her assistant, some blonde kid who looked like he was barely out of business school, followed 2 steps behind, whispering urgently. She ignored him. When she saw me at the front of the room, her stride faltered for half a beat. Just half. But I caught it. Everyone did. She hadn't known I'd be here. Her eyes swept the table, landing on Alton, then flicking to the screen where Nova's logo rotated like a quiet warning. Mason, she said. I turned slowly, keeping my posture relaxed, my voice calm. Brielle. Didn't expect to see you here. It wasn't mockery. It was precision. I met her with the same cool detachment she'd once used to fire me over the phone. The room waited. Every breath held like glass about to crack. She started, but Alton cut in smoothly. Perfect timing, Brielle. We were just walking through the core differentiators between legacy analytics platforms and Mason's Nova system. Fascinating stuff. She blinked. Once. Twice. Then recovered. She smiled that press-friendly smile and stepped forward, voice lacquered in charm. Well, I'm sure it is, she said. But some of us still believe in the systems we already trust. Stability matters. Until it doesn't, I said. Especially when the underlying IP is compromised. Her eyes flared, barely perceptible, but enough. The others glanced between us like spectators at a high-stakes chess match. They didn't know the history, but they could feel it. Something electric. I walked slowly around the table, fingers grazing the back of a chair. I used to sit beside Brielle, I said. Built the system she rides on today. But what most of you don't know is, I never signed over the original architecture. The engine that powered Echelon's rise? The one still running their models? It was mine. Always was. A pause. The kind that chokes a room in tension. Alton leaned forward and slid a folder onto the table. Thick. Sealed. We'll be acquiring full integration rights to Nova, he said, including the underlying analytics system. Mason's engine. You could feel her mask slipping. Just slightly. Her fingers twitched. Her smile tightened. That system is proprietary, she said carefully. Only if you can prove it, I replied, reaching into my case and pulling out a second folder. I slid it across the table toward her. This might help clarify your legal exposure. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside, patent paperwork. Time-stamped. Digitally certified. My name. Not hers. Not Echelon's. The silence became a living thing. Her assistant leaned over her shoulder and whispered something again. She didn't respond. I watched her jaw move, tight, grinding. She closed the folder slowly, methodically. Mason, she said, voice low now. Can we speak privately? No, I said. We're not in private anymore. Because this was the moment I'd been walking towards since that phone call. Not a scene of vengeance, but a reckoning. She'd humiliated me in front of an entire company. Locked me out of my own home. Laughed when she thought I had nowhere left to go. And now, I was standing between her and the future. A man beside me. One of the investors, a gray-bearded financier who'd built 3 tech unicorns, cleared his throat. How soon can Nova be operational? I didn't look at Brielle. I looked at him. Beta testing starts in 3 weeks, I said. Full deployment by the next quarter. He nodded. Put me down for 40 million. Another voice chimed in. Then another. Brielle didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stood there as commitment after commitment stacked around her like bricks. I didn't smile. I didn't need to, because I'd already won. And the best part? I hadn't needed to shout or scheme or burn it all down. All I had to do was build something worth standing behind and sit at the head of the table she never thought I'd reach. She thought the shock was seeing me at the head of the table. She thought that was the twist, Mason, the discarded husband, standing beside her biggest rival, flanked by the very investors who used to hang on her every word. She thought that was the moment where the camera would freeze, the score would rise, and the audience would gasp. But that wasn't it. That was just the opening scene. The real surprise was what came next. Brielle had remained standing long after everyone else settled back into their seats. Her expression had softened into a professional calm, but I could see the tension in her neck, the way her fingers coiled tightly around the folder I'd given her. I'd seen her wear that face during merger calls when she was bluffing with numbers she didn't fully believe. It was the same face she wore the night she convinced me to let her pitch my early prototypes under the Echelon name, just to help us get some traction, she had said. Alton tapped a finger against the folder he dropped earlier, the one detailing the Nova acquisition. As discussed, we'll be taking full integration rights, including analytics architecture, client access frameworks, and future licensing privileges. He leaned back in his chair like a man who already knew the board vote was unanimous. The valuation was finalized this morning. Brielle's voice came out tight. Valuation? $500 million, I said, casually, as if we weren't talking about $500 million worth of intelligence infrastructure. We closed the term sheet before this meeting. Someone across the table let out a low whistle. Another investor smiled to himself, already running numbers. I turned to Brielle. Her eyes were locked on me now, no longer pretending to smile, no longer playing gracious. You can't sell what belongs to Echelon. I'm not selling anything that belongs to Echelon, I said calmly. You would know that if you'd ever taken the time to understand what we were building. You remember that stack of contracts I gave you 2 years ago? The ones you handed to Myra to sort through? You never signed the transfer clause. Legally, the architecture remained mine. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her brain was trying to catch up with her pride. Alton opened his own folder and slid a second document across the table. Here's the kicker, Brielle. This deal doesn't just move us forward, it protects us retroactively. Mason's system has been running at Echelon without a signed transfer of IP rights, which means you may have unknowingly exposed your firm to unauthorized usage claims. Brielle's eyes flicked to her assistant. He looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. There's no way, she whispered. No one's ever questioned the system. Because it worked, I cut in. But only because I kept it stable from the back end. Every time your output started drifting off target, that was me fixing the code through an access key I buried in the developer log, one that expires tonight, by the way. The room went silent. She swallowed, visibly. Then, as if desperate to reassert control, she said, "We'll take this to court." "You're welcome to," I said, gesturing toward the thick folder she hadn't dared open fully yet. "That's my patent paperwork. Filed, timestamped, verified. The metadata alone proves origin. And even if you tried to dispute authorship, your own system logs, dated commits, login trails, developer notes, all point back to me. And they're already archived with mine." I leaned forward. "Yes, you did. You just thought you'd be on the winning side." The investors remained silent, watching her unravel. No one was coming to her defense. No one was offering a lifeline. She wasn't the queen in this room. Not anymore. She was a name on a receding headline, and everyone here knew it. Then I pushed one final document across the table. "This is a courtesy," I said. "A full summary of Echelon's current liability, including usage of my system since the date of the unsigned transfer clause. Retroactive licensing could save you a PR crisis, provided you come to terms by Friday." Her lips moved like she wanted to argue, but there was no argument to make. The walls she'd built weren't made of steel. They were made of glass. And now the sunlight was pouring in. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You planned this." "No," I said. "You did. I just kept the receipts." It was true. Every decision she'd made. Every time she sidelined someone for daring to question her. Every contract she ignored. Every bridge she burned while I sat quietly behind her had paved the road to this moment. She was so sure she didn't need anyone else. So sure she could twist the truth into any shape she wanted. But code doesn't lie. Ownership doesn't forget. And signatures? Well, the ones that aren't signed have consequences too. Alton rose from his chair. "This meeting's adjourned. We've got contracts to finalize." The investors stood slowly, murmuring among themselves. Some glanced at Brielle with a mix of curiosity and detachment, like watching a magician caught using cheap tricks. She didn't move. Neither did I. Once the room cleared, it was just the two of us. I stood and looked down at her. You used to say I didn't understand power, I said. But I do now. Power isn't control. It's trust. It's knowing your value, even when someone else tries to erase it. She blinked quickly. The first crack of real emotion passed through her face. Why didn't you ever fight me before? She asked. Because I believed in us, I said. Even when you didn't. I walked out without looking back. The hallway felt longer than usual, but lighter too. Outside, the sun cut through the skyline like a clean blade, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a ghost in someone else's story. This was my story now, and I had just turned the page. The call came just after midnight. I had just shut my laptop, the glow of Nova's latest interface still lingering behind my eyes, and was about to pour myself a quiet drink when the screen of my phone lit up across the table. Unknown number. But I knew. Instinctively. Some part of me recognized the weight behind the silence, the tremble in the digital air even before I answered. Hello, I said. There was a pause. Then her voice. Mason. Brielle didn't sound like herself. Gone was the confident, calculated woman who could sell sand to the desert. Her voice cracked slightly on the syllables, and for a second, I thought maybe it was an imposter. But no, there it was. That falter beneath the breath, the one I'd heard only twice before, the night her father died, and the night her IPO almost collapsed before we patched the numbers behind the scenes. You can't do this, she said quietly. You can't. Mason, we built that system together. I sat back in the armchair by the window, the city glittering faintly beyond the glass like it had no idea a war was ending inside a single conversation. We didn't build it together, I said. I built it. You branded it. You're rewriting history, she snapped, her voice sharpening. You used my connections, my platform, my capital, and I used my brain, I said flatly. We both brought something to the table, Brielle, but only one of us tried to flip the table over. She was quiet again, but I could hear her breathing. Fast, unsteady. That was rare for her. She'd made a career out of pretending nothing ever rattled her. I didn't think it would go this far, she said finally. No, I agreed. You thought I'd break. Crawl back. Settle for mopping floors while you tossed champagne on the balcony. That wasn't me, she said, like it mattered. Your voice was on the call, I said. Myra laughed in the background. And you didn't stop her. I was angry. No, I cut in. You were arrogant. There's a difference. Her silence then was telling. Waited. She knew it too. I lost sight of things, she said softer now. I kept climbing, and somewhere along the way I forgot how we started. I forgot what you gave up. That almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because of how long it had taken her to admit something that had been choking me for years. You didn't forget, I said. You ignored it. There's a difference there, too. Mason, listen. No, I said again, firm now. You don't get to frame this like a misunderstanding. You fired me over the phone. You locked me out of the house I paid for. You paraded me as the tech mind behind Echelon until it stopped serving your narrative. You used my work, my trust, and my silence. She was breathing harder now. So what do you want? Is this about revenge? You've made your point. You've humiliated me, Mason. You've won. I didn't want to humiliate you, I said. If I did, I would have gone to the press with everything. I would have leaked internal documents, old emails, broken the story wide open, and made you the villain in every headline. I didn't do that. Then what do you want? She whispered. I looked out the window for a long moment. I want you to learn the difference between being powerful and being respected. She didn't respond right away. When she finally did, her voice was hoarse. Please, Mason, just tell me what it would take to make this go away. And there it was. The thing I never thought I'd hear from Brielle. Desperation. Not the kind that clawed and fought. The kind that wilted. The kind that came after the free fall, when you realized your parachute was stitched together by ego and guesswork. It's already done, I said. Nova's secured. The contracts are signed. Your access is gone. The system you're still using will degrade until it's unusable. I've given you the courtesy of a retroactive license to avoid litigation. You can take that. Or not. She sounded smaller when she asked, and after that? After that, you figure out who you are without pretending to be the smartest person in the room. Another pause. Then, finally, you really hate me now, don't you? I closed my eyes. Not from exhaustion, but clarity. No, I said. I don't hate you. I pity you. She gasped a little at that. Maybe she'd been bracing for venom. But this cut differently. Because it was clean. Honest. I loved you, I said, the words surprisingly steady. Not the brand. Not the business partner. You. I wanted to build a life. A legacy. But you wanted something shinier. Something that needed me quiet and convenient. I let that sit. Mason. I didn't respond. I'm sorry, she whispered, and for the first time, I believed she meant it. But I didn't say anything back. Some silences are necessary. Some silences are healing. I hope you find what you're looking for, she said finally. I already did, I replied. It was never about beating you, Brielle. It was about becoming myself again. Then I ended the call. No flourish. No final blow. Just silence. I set the phone down and leaned back in the chair, staring at the skyline. For the first time in 2 years, I felt the quiet settle in my chest, not like a weight, but like a breath finally let out. I didn't check my inbox. I didn't revisit old files. I didn't reach for a drink to chase down the echoes. I just sat there, and I slept deep, uninterrupted, and dreamless for the first time in years. Because some battles aren't won with swords. Some are won the moment you realize you don't need to fight anymore. It didn't take long for the headlines to come. 3 days after our last conversation, the digital world cracked open. It began with a whisper. A niche tech blog published a piece titled, "Echelon's engine may not be its own." It was the kind of headline most readers would scroll past. But the people who mattered? They didn't scroll. They clicked. They read. They dug deeper. By the end of the week, it wasn't just blogs. It was Techline, Business Current, The Wall Street Sentinel. Whistleblower reveals IP theft inside Echelon Global. Former CTO alleges unauthorized use of proprietary code. Predictive giant facing lawsuit over system rights. I hadn't filed a lawsuit. Not yet. But word spreads fast when the foundation is cracking. The rumor alone was enough to trigger panic. By Friday, the board called an emergency session. I didn't attend. I didn't have to. I got the play-by-play through back channels, texts from former colleagues, industry insiders, even 2 of the investors who had backed Brielle during her ascension. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. Brielle was asked to step down. Effective immediately. Myra went with her. Apparently, she tried to defend Brielle during the meeting, tried to redirect the conversation toward market confidence and forward vision. But it backfired. One of the board members reportedly asked, "If you're so confident, why was your sister using a system she didn't own?" Myra stammered. And just like that, the show was over. There were no cameras, no dramatic walkouts. Just 2 women who had spent years building an empire of image, escorted quietly out of the building by security. I didn't cheer. I didn't celebrate. Because it wasn't a victory. Not really. It was closure. The morning after the announcement, I stood on the balcony of my new office. It wasn't enormous. It didn't need to be. It had tall windows, natural light, and the kind of quiet you earn, not purchase. My team was already buzzing downstairs. Marin was holding a design review. 2 engineers were running diagnostics. And Damon, who I'd finally invited to join Nova full-time, was fine-tuning our data hygiene protocol with a level of focus that made me proud. They were building something honest, and they trusted me to lead it. That was the real win. I sipped my coffee and watched the city hum to life. Billboards flashed. Buses roared down avenues. Somewhere, someone else was getting blindsided by betrayal, by ego, by the kind of miscalculation that costs more than money. But not me. Not anymore. At noon, an email landed in my inbox. Subject: Lock access termination confirmation. It was from a security firm I'd hired weeks ago, the day after Brielle changed the locks on what had been our home. The email was brief. Per your request, all biometric and keycard access to the former residence has been disabled. Systems have been rekeyed to your private signature. You are now the sole property owner on record. I read it twice. Not because I was surprised, but because I wanted to feel what that truly meant. The locks they changed to keep me out? They were guarding nothing worth keeping. The house was a shell now. She had left it behind when the board ousted her. My attorney handled the paperwork quietly, transferring the deed after an unpaid tax violation surfaced. Echelon had covered a lot of Brielle's personal costs. Once that dam broke, the unraveling was swift. I could have sold the house. I still might. But for now, it stood as a quiet monument. Not to what we lost, but to what I survived. Later that afternoon, I walked into the old Echelon headquarters. Not as an employee, not as a visitor, just as a man returning to a place that no longer held power over him. Someone else's name was on the door now. A new interim CEO brought in to stabilize the company and mitigate the damage. A damage control expert. He didn't know me. Didn't need to. I didn't stop. I didn't knock on old doors or peer through glass walls. I just walked the perimeter once, breathing in the sterile, lemon-scented air of a company trying desperately to pretend it wasn't bleeding. There were whispers in the halls. Familiar faces glanced at me, then looked away. Not in shame, just recognition. Like they knew I had seen the inside of the storm and walked out unburned. Outside, I stood on the same sidewalk where I had once carried my laptop in silence, fired by the woman I built a future with. Back then, I felt erased. Now, I felt whole. I took the long way home. Not because I had anything to prove, but because the air was crisp and I had time. Time to reflect. Time to breathe. Time to finally believe that I was free. And the funny thing? I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Brielle. Not at Myra. Not even at myself. Because for all the destruction they tried to bring into my life, they also gave me something I couldn't have discovered otherwise. A reminder that power taken by force can always be taken back. But power earned through integrity, resilience, and relentless truth? That's unshakable. Let the headlines keep circling. Let the analysts debate the fall. Let the investors reassign their loyalties. As for me, I wasn't watching anymore. I was building. And every brick, every line of code, every honest conversation with my team was a new beginning. A beginning no one could take from me. Not again. The wind was gentler than usual that morning, cool, dry, tugging at my coat as I stood across the street from Echelon's old headquarters. The sun had just climbed over the skyline, throwing soft gold light across the upper windows. There was a new logo above the entryway now, sleek, minimalist, expensive. A name I didn't recognize, some acquired brand with no soul behind it, just a placeholder until the building reinvented itself again. I didn't cross the street, didn't get any closer than the sidewalk. I didn't need to. This was no longer my war zone. No longer the place where I'd ground my fingers against a keyboard at 2 in the morning to salvage another earnings report. No longer the stage for whispered betrayals, for watching the woman I loved slowly twist into someone I didn't recognize. No longer the pedestal I once stood on, only to find the foundation had been rotting beneath me. I took one last look at the building, then turned away. Closure didn't need fireworks. My new office was 5 blocks east, modest, intentionally underdesigned, tucked inside a repurposed industrial building with exposed brick and coffee-stained floors. You had to buzz twice at the entrance and walk past a bookstore to find it. That was how I wanted it. No marble, no nonsense. Inside, my team was already working. Damon was on a call in the open meeting space, a notebook full of scribbles in his lap. Marin was half sitting on a desk, chewing a pin cap while reviewing wireframes with one of the developers. Everyone was moving, alive, humming with energy, not because someone was watching, but because they believed in what we were building. Because they had a stake in it, a voice in it. That's what Nova had become, not just a product, not just a platform, but a philosophy. And the difference was this. People weren't afraid to speak here. I walked past the coffee machine, dropped my bag on my desk, and slid open the drawer. Inside was a pen. Nothing fancy. Just a black matte fountain pen I'd bought for myself the day the Nova acquisition closed. I hadn't used it yet. Until now. I pulled out the folder on my desk, something I'd been working on for weeks in the background, the roadmap for Nova 2.0. It wasn't about expanding the client base or maximizing margins. It was about evolution. About widening the scope of what behavioral analytics could do, using it not just to understand consumer patterns, but to help people make decisions that align with their values, their mental health, their long-term goals. A partnership between AI and agency, not manipulation, collaboration. I clicked the pen open and signed the top page with a quiet stroke of ink. My name, my vision, not hers. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a moment, letting the hum of the office settle around me like a second skin. This wasn't what I thought success would look like. It wasn't penthouses or headlines. It was peace. It was walking into a space and not bracing for impact. It was not checking the door twice. Not wondering who was whispering behind your back or pulling the strings just out of view. It was knowing that the people around you weren't afraid to say your name out loud. That you could be human here, flawed, evolving, but present. A knock sounded at my glass wall. I turned. Damon stood there, holding up 2 coffees and an envelope. "Mail for you," he said, stepping inside. I took the coffee with a nod and opened the envelope. It was from my attorney. Inside, final confirmation that the last remnant of my IP dispute had been closed, sealed, and settled. No residual claims. No litigation pending. My name, officially and permanently, was attached to every line of code that built Nova. And Echelon? They'd signed the licensing agreement for retroactive use just 1 hour before the statute ran out. Quietly. No press release. No statement. They folded the same way they rose, strategically, surgically, without apology. Damon watched me read it, eyebrows raised. "Good news. The best kind," I said. "The kind that doesn't need to be shouted." He grinned and tapped the coffee cup. "You know, this whole thing's been kind of cinematic." I smirked. "You've been watching too many documentaries." "I mean, come on," he said. "Guy gets blindsided by his wife, fired from his own company, disappears for a while, and then comes back swinging with something better. That's a screenplay waiting to happen." I shrugged. "It's just life." He looked around the office, at the team scribbling on whiteboards and typing through meetings, then back at me. "You really don't feel like rubbing it in?" "Why?" I said. "They already know, and I'm not writing this story for them anymore." He nodded slowly, then turned to leave. "Still, if you ever need someone to play you in the movie, let me know. I've been practicing my calm but devastating monologues." I laughed. A real one. When he left, I turned back to the window, my fingers running along the edge of the signed page. I thought back to the man I was that day Brielle called. The man who stared out an office window, blindsided, heartbroken in two, told by the woman he trusted most that he was disposable. That man didn't exist anymore. I didn't want him back. I was the man with the pen now. The man who rewrote the ending. And more importantly, the one writing the next chapter. Not for revenge. Not for approval. But for peace. For purpose. Because I learned the hard way, success isn't about proving people wrong. It's about finally remembering who you are and choosing to be that person every damn day without asking for permission. Outside, the city pulsed on. But inside, I was still, whole. And this time, I held the pen. My wife's sister's wedding planner called. "Your wife canceled your invitation, but asked to keep the $50,000 deposit you paid." I said, "Cancel the entire wedding." She gasped. "But sir, you're not the groom dash." "No, but I own the venue, the catering company, and the hotel chain they booked for guests." Tuesday mornings at Kingsley Group usually started the same way. Black coffee, financial reports spread across my mahogany desk, and the steady hum of Seattle's business district 30 floors below. I'd built this empire from nothing, starting with a single food truck and a dream that most people would have called crazy. Now, at 31, I was running a company worth more than most small countries' GDP, but nobody in my personal life seemed to give a damn about that part of my story. I was knee-deep in quarterly projections when my assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, cutting through my concentration like a knife through butter. "Mr. Harland, there's a call from Magnolia and Pine Wedding Planners online too." Her tone was professional as always, but I caught that slight hesitation that meant she wasn't sure if this was worth my time. Honestly, I almost hit the decline button right then and there. Wedding planners weren't exactly my usual clientele, at least not directly. But then it hit me like a ton of bricks. Ava's wedding. My sister-in-law was getting hitched next month to some hotshot doctor named Trevor, and the whole family had been buzzing about it for months. More importantly, I'd quietly cut a check for 50 grand to help cover the costs because Brooke, my wife of 7 years, had come to me with tears in her eyes talking about how her family was strapped for cash and couldn't afford the wedding Ava had always dreamed of. I'd written that check without thinking twice about it. No fanfare. No expectation of gratitude, no strings attached. Just a quiet gesture from a guy who'd grown up with nothing and understood what it meant to want something beautiful for the people you love. Hell, I didn't even want them to know it came from me. I'd specifically asked the wedding planner to keep my contribution anonymous. Sometimes the best gifts are the ones nobody knows you gave. "Put them through," I told my assistant, straightening my tie and settling back into my leather chair. The Seattle skyline stretched out before me through floor-to-ceiling windows, a concrete jungle I'd learned to navigate and eventually conquer. But family stuff? That was still uncharted territory, even after all these years. Grayson Harlan speaking. I said into the phone, using the same tone I'd use for any business call. Professional, direct, no nonsense. The voice on the other end was female, probably mid-30s, with that particular blend of nervousness and professionalism that told me this wasn't going to be a routine conversation. Mr. Harlan, this is Isla from Magnolia and Pine Wedding Planners. I'm calling about the Henderson-Morrison wedding next month. She paused, and I could practically hear her choosing her words carefully. I'm afraid I have some rather uncomfortable news to share with you. My gut clenched. In my experience, when people started conversations with phrases like uncomfortable news, somebody was about to get screwed over, and it usually wasn't the person making the call. I'd heard those words plenty of times in business, right before a partner tried to snake a deal or a competitor attempted a hostile takeover. But this was supposed to be about a wedding, for Christ's sake. Go ahead, I said, keeping my voice level. I'd learned a long time ago that showing emotion in these situations was like showing your cards in poker. It never ended well. Well, sir, your wife contacted us yesterday with some specific requests regarding the guest arrangements. Another pause, longer this time. She requested that your name be removed from the guest list entirely. She also inquired about whether the $50,000 deposit you provided could remain with us, given that the funds have already been allocated to various vendors. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral, staring out at the city below. Cars moved like ants along the streets, people going about their business, completely unaware that my world had just shifted on its axis. Removed from the guest list. My own sister-in-law's wedding. The wedding I'd bankrolled out of love and generosity. They'd taken my money and kicked me to the curb like some unwanted party crasher. I felt that familiar coldness settle over me. The same ice-cold calm that had helped me close billion-dollar deals and survive in a business world that ate nice guys for breakfast. It was the kind of calm that made smart people nervous and stupid people overconfident. I see, I said finally, my voice carrying none of the rage that was building in my chest like a pressure cooker. And did my wife provide any reasoning for this request? She mentioned something about wanting to avoid potential drama and keeping the celebration focused on the happy couple. Isla replied, clearly uncomfortable with having to relay this message. She assured us that you would understand and that the financial contribution was intended as a gift regardless of your attendance. A gift, 7 years of marriage, and my wife thought she could erase me from a family celebration like I was some embarrassing relative who drank too much at parties. The woman who'd cried in my arms about her family's financial struggles, who'd begged me to help make her sister's day special, had just stabbed me in the back with a smile. I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of power settling around my shoulders like an expensive suit. There was something almost poetic about this moment. The quiet guy they'd all underestimated was about to remind them exactly who they were dealing with. Cancel the entire wedding, I said calmly, as if I was ordering lunch instead of dropping a nuclear bomb on what was supposed to be the happiest day of two people's lives. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that I almost wondered if the call had dropped. Then I heard Isla's sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like papers rustling frantically. I'm sorry, Mr. Harlan, but I don't think I understand. You want to cancel your attendance? No, I replied, leaning back in my chair and allowing myself the smallest of smiles. I want you to cancel the entire wedding. All of it. Every vendor, every service, every reservation. Cancel it all. But sir, she stammered, you're not the groom. I don't have the authority to. Actually, I interrupted, my voice still perfectly calm. I think you'll find that you do. The stunned silence on the other end of the line was absolutely delicious. I could practically hear Isla's brain scrambling to process what I'd just told her, probably flipping through contracts and vendor agreements like her life depended on it. In the business world, I'd learned to appreciate these moments. The split second when someone realizes they've been playing checkers while you've been playing chess the entire time. But sir, she finally managed, her voice shaking slightly, you're not the groom. I don't understand how you could possibly have the authority to cancel an entire wedding that you're not even technically part of anymore. I leaned back in my executive chair, the buttery leather creaking softly as I shifted position. Through my office windows, Seattle stretched out below me like a kingdom I'd conquered one deal at a time. The Space Needle pierced the cloudy morning sky in the distance, and for a moment I felt like I was looking down at my own personal chessboard, ready to make the move that would change everything. "You're absolutely right, Isla," I said, letting a hint of amusement creep into my voice. "I'm not the groom. But here's the thing that nobody in my wife's family seems to understand. I don't need to be the groom to control this entire situation." I could hear her breathing quicken on the other end of the line, probably sensing that she was about to learn something that would flip her world upside down. I'd been in her shoes before, back when I was young and naive enough to think that the person sitting across from you in a business meeting was always exactly who they appeared to be. "Let me paint you a picture, Isla. You work for Magnolia and Pine Wedding Planners, correct? Nice little company. Been around for about 8 years now. Specializes in high-end celebrations for Seattle's elite families. I'm sure you're proud to work there." "Yes, sir," she whispered, and I could tell she was starting to put the pieces together even though she probably didn't want to believe what her gut was telling her. "Well, here's something that might interest you. Magnolia and Pine is owned by a larger company called Landmark Events, which handles event planning and hospitality services throughout the Pacific Northwest." "And Landmark Events?" "That falls under the umbrella of my holding company, Harlan Ventures." I paused, letting that sink in before delivering the knockout punch. "Which means, technically speaking, you work for me." The gasp that came through the phone was so sharp I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I remembered my wife's smug text about keeping my $50,000 and calling my legitimate hurt feelings drama, and any sympathy I might have felt evaporated like morning mist. "Oh my God," she breathed, and I could hear papers rustling frantically in the background. She was probably pulling up corporate documents, trying to verify what I'd just told her, hoping against hope that I was bluffing or mistaken. "But wait, there's more," I continued, channeling my inner infomercial host. "The venue where this wedding is supposed to take place, Willowcrest Estate? That gorgeous property with the gardens and the lakefront view that Ava's been gushing about for months? Yeah, that's mine too. I bought it 3 years ago through a subsidiary called Pacific Properties. Beautiful place, isn't it? I particularly love what we've done with the rose garden." Silence. Complete, total silence. I imagined Isla sitting at her desk, probably staring at her computer screen in horror as she realized the full scope of what she was dealing with. In the background, I could hear the faint sounds of her office. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the normal soundtrack of people going about their business completely unaware that their colleague was having her entire understanding of reality rearranged. "And since we're on the topic," I continued, feeling like a magician revealing the secret behind an impossible trick, "let's talk about Crown Fork Catering. You know, the company that's supposed to be handling the reception dinner? The one with the award-winning chef and the 5-star reputation? I own that too. Bought them out 2 years ago when they were struggling with debt. Turned them into one of the most sought-after catering companies on the West Coast." I stood up and walked over to my window, looking down at the city that had taught me everything I knew about power, money, and the importance of keeping your cards close to your chest. Down there, millions of people were going about their daily lives, most of them completely unaware that the quiet guy they might pass on the street controlled a significant chunk of their city's hospitality industry. "Oh, and Grandon Hotels," I added, almost as an afterthought. "That's the chain where all 120 wedding guests have their reservations, right? The beautiful historic property downtown with the marble lobby and the panoramic city views? Guess what? That's part of my portfolio too. I acquired the entire chain last year when they were expanding into the Pacific Northwest market." The sound that came through the phone wasn't quite a sob, but it wasn't far off. I'd just systematically dismantled this woman's understanding of the situation, revealing that every single vendor, every venue, every service provider connected to this wedding ultimately answered to me. "So you see, Isla," I said, my voice returning to that calm, professional tone that had served me so well in boardrooms and negotiation tables. "While I may not be the groom, I am quite literally the foundation that this entire celebration is built on. Every contract traces back to me. Every service provider works for companies I own. Every reservation was made at properties I control." I could hear her breathing heavily now, probably trying to figure out how to handle a situation that wasn't covered in any wedding planning manual. "Send cancellation notices to all vendors immediately," I instructed, my voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who was used to being obeyed without question. Refund any deposits that the guests paid directly, and bill my wife's family for the remaining balance of all services, minus the $50,000 I'm keeping as a cancellation fee for their disrespect. Mr. Harland, she whispered, are you sure about this? I smiled, though she couldn't see it. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. After I hung up with Isla, I sat back in my chair and let out a long breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a guy worth more than $2.5 billion, and my own wife's family had spent the last 7 years treating me like I was some kind of charity case who'd lucked into marrying above his station. The thing is, I'd never told Brooke or her family who I really was. Not completely, anyway. When people asked what I did for a living, I'd just say I ran a small business and leave it at that. It wasn't exactly a lie. Kingsley Group had started small, just me and a beat-up food truck I'd bought with my last $2,000 after dropping out of law school. But somewhere along the way, that little business had grown into something that would make most Fortune 500 CEOs weep with envy. I'd never felt the need to brag about it, you know? Money talks, but wealth whispers, and I'd always preferred the whisper approach. Maybe it was because I'd grown up dirt poor in a trailer park outside Tacoma, watching my mom work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. When you've been hungry, really hungry, not just I skipped lunch, hungry, you learn that flashy displays of wealth are usually just insecurity wearing a designer suit. But Brooke's family? They'd never learned that lesson. They were middle-class folks who'd built their entire identity around keeping up appearances and making sure everyone knew exactly where they stood in the social pecking order. And in their minds, I was definitely at the bottom of that order. Take Trevor, for instance, Ava's fiancé and the golden boy of the family. Dr. Trevor Morrison, with his perfectly styled hair, his BMW, and his habit of mentioning his medical degree in casual conversation like it was some kind of magic spell that made everyone automatically respect him. The guy made decent money, sure, probably pulled in around $300,000 a year, which isn't pocket change by any stretch. But compared to what I was sitting on, he might as well have been flipping burgers. Yet every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every casual get-together inevitably turned into the Trevor Appreciation Hour. Did you hear Trevor just bought a new house? Trevor's getting promoted to chief of cardiology. Trevor's so stable and successful. Ava's so lucky. And then there was me, sitting quietly at the end of the table like some kind of furniture that everyone had gotten used to ignoring. The guy who showed up in jeans and a button-down shirt while Trevor was sporting his designer threads. The guy who drove a 5-year-old Ford F-150 instead of a luxury sedan. The guy who never talked about work because, honestly, what was I supposed to say? Oh, I just closed a deal to acquire a hotel chain in Vancouver. How was your day? Dennis and Lorraine, Brooke's parents, had made their feelings about me crystal clear from day one. They'd never said it outright. They were too polite for that. But the message came through loud and clear in 1,000 little ways. The way Dennis would talk business with Trevor at dinner while completely ignoring me. The way Lorraine would gush about Trevor's achievements while giving me these sympathetic little smiles like I was some kind of wounded puppy she felt sorry for. I'll never forget this one dinner about 2 years ago. We were all sitting around their dining room table, and Dennis was going on and on about Trevor's latest promotion. Finally, he turned to me with this condescending smile and said, "Well, Grayson, at least Ava's marrying someone stable. Someone with real prospects, you know." The implication was clear as day. Unlike you, the guy who married our other daughter and clearly peaked in high school. I'd just nodded and said something non-committal about Trevor being a good guy, which he actually was, despite his family's annoying habit of treating him like the second coming of Jesus Christ. But that comment had stuck with me, eating away at my gut like acid. At least Ava's marrying someone stable. As if I was some kind of deadbeat who couldn't provide for his wife. Some loser who'd somehow conned their precious daughter into settling for less than she deserved. The truth was, I'd been supporting Brooke financially for years without making a big deal about it. When she wanted to go back to school to get her master's degree, who do you think paid for it? When her car died and she needed a replacement, who cut the check? When she decided she wanted to start her own little boutique business that never quite got off the ground, who funded that pipe dream? Me. Every single time. It was me writing the checks and telling her not to worry about paying me back because we were married and what was mine was hers. I'd done it all quietly, without fanfare, because that's what you do for the people you love. You take care of them, and you don't make them feel small about needing help. But apparently, taking care of your family financially doesn't count as being stable if you do it without bragging about it every 5 minutes. I dropped out of law school at 24 because I'd seen an opportunity that most people would have called crazy. Food trucks were just starting to become a thing, and I'd had this vision of building something bigger, something that could eventually expand into catering, then venues, then hospitality. My professors thought I'd lost my mind. My classmates figured I'd flunk out of the real world within 6 months. Instead, I'd built an empire. 40 venues across 3 states, 18 catering companies with 5-star reputations, 9 hotel properties that were booked solid year-round, and a dozen other vendor companies that most people had never heard of but that quietly dominated their respective markets. But according to my in-laws, I was just the quiet guy who ran some small business and would never measure up to their precious Dr. Trevor. Well, they were about to learn exactly what my small business could do when it decided to flex its muscles. And something told me that by the time this was all over, they'd have a very different understanding of what stable actually looked like. I was still sitting there, processing the nuclear bomb I'd just dropped on Isla and trying to figure out my next move, when my phone buzzed against my desk like an angry wasp. The screen lit up with Brooke's name, and for just a split second, I felt that familiar flutter of hope in my chest. Maybe she was calling to apologize, to tell me there'd been some horrible misunderstanding, to explain that she'd never meant to cut me out of her sister's wedding like I was some kind of unwanted relative. But it wasn't a call. It was a text. And the moment I read those words, whatever small piece of my heart that still belonged to my wife of 7 years crumbled into dust. Please don't cause drama. You're not coming to Ava's wedding. We'll be keeping the money. You offered it as a gift anyway. Let's talk when you've calmed down. I stared at that message for a long time, reading it over and over again, each word hitting me like a physical blow. The casual dismissal of my feelings. The assumption that I was being dramatic for being hurt by their betrayal. The entitled way she talked about keeping my $50,000 like it was pocket change she'd found in the couch cushions. But what really got to me, what made something cold and hard settle in my chest like a stone, was that phrase. Let's talk when you've calmed down. Calm down. Like I was some kind of unhinged lunatic throwing a temper tantrum instead of a man who'd just discovered that his own wife had orchestrated his humiliation behind his back. Like my perfectly reasonable response to being erased from a family celebration I'd bankrolled was just some irrational emotional outburst that would pass once I came to my senses. I'd been with Brooke for 7 years. 7 years of marriage, 2 years of dating before that, 9 years of my life invested in this woman. And she thought she could just text me like I was some casual acquaintance she was blowing off for lunch plans. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger that makes you punch walls and say things you'll regret later. No, this was the cold, calculating kind of fury that had helped me crush competitors and close impossible deals. This was the kind of anger that didn't cloud your judgment. It sharpened it like a blade. Because here's what really hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just about Ava's wedding. This was about Brooke too. My wife, the woman who'd promised to love, honor, and cherish me until death do us part, had been the mastermind behind this whole thing. She wasn't some innocent bystander who'd gotten caught up in her family's drama. She was the one who'd called the wedding planner and asked to have my name removed from the guest list. She was the one who'd inquired about keeping my money while kicking me to the curb. I thought back to all those conversations we'd had about the wedding over the past few months. Brooke coming to me with tears in her eyes, talking about how stressed Ava was about the costs, how her parents were struggling financially, how heartbroken her sister would be if she couldn't have the wedding of her dreams. I'd written that check without hesitation because I'd thought I was helping my family, our family. But apparently, I'd been wrong about that, our part. The woman I'd supported through graduate school, the woman whose car payments I'd covered when she was between jobs, the woman whose failed business ventures I'd funded without complaint. She'd been planning to humiliate me this entire time. While I was writing checks and playing the role of the generous brother-in-law, she'd been plotting with her family about how to cut me out of the picture once my usefulness had expired. I wondered how long they'd been planning this. Had it been weeks? Months? Had they all been sitting around the dinner table, laughing about how easy it was to manipulate the quiet guy who never fought back? Had Brooke been texting her sister about what a pushover her husband was, how he'd pay for anything if you just gave him a sob story and some crocodile tears? The betrayal cut deeper than any business deal gone wrong, any competitor's dirty trick, any setback I'd ever faced in building my empire. Because this wasn't just about money or power or business. This was about the person I'd trusted most in the world deciding that I was disposable. I thought about all the times I'd defended Brooke to people who'd suggested she might be using me. Colleagues who'd made jokes about trophy wives and gold diggers. Friends who'd raised eyebrows when they found out I was paying for her lifestyle without getting much in return. I'd always shut those conversations down, insisting that Brooke loved me for who I was, not what I could provide. Turns out I'd been the only one who actually believed that. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Brooke. Gray, I know you're upset, but please try to understand. This is Ava's day, and we can't have any family drama ruining it. You'll get over this. You'll get over this. Like being erased from my own family was just some minor inconvenience I'd eventually forget about. Like 7 years of marriage meant so little to her that she could just wave her hand and expect me to accept being treated like garbage. I deleted both messages without responding. There was nothing to say to her right now, nothing that wouldn't make things worse than they already were. Besides, I had a feeling that very soon, Brooke was going to understand exactly what kind of drama her family had just invited into their lives. And somehow, I doubted she was going to get over it nearly as easily as she expected me to. I didn't have to wait long to see the results of my handiwork. In the business world, I'd learned that information travels at the speed of panic and wedding cancellations. They spread through family networks faster than wildfire through dry brush. I was nursing my third cup of coffee and pretending to review some acquisition reports when my phone started ringing off the hook. The first call came exactly 45 minutes after I'd hung up with Isla. The caller ID showed Dennis Whitmore, my father-in-law, the man who'd spent the better part of 7 years treating me like I was some kind of charity case his daughter had dragged home out of misplaced sympathy. I let it ring 3 times before picking up, just to let him sweat a little. Grayson. His voice was tight with barely controlled panic, and I could hear Lorraine yelling something in the background that sounded like a wounded animal. What the hell is going on? Why is Ava's wedding canceled? The planner just called and said all the vendors are backing out. I leaned back in my chair, watching a seagull perch on the ledge outside my office window. Even from 30 floors up, that bird looked more dignified than the man currently hyperventilating into my ear. Because you uninvited me, Dennis, I said calmly, like I was explaining basic math to a kindergartner. And as it turns out, I own everything you booked for this little celebration. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the clock ticking on my office wall. Then Dennis made this choking sound, like someone had just punched him in the solar plexus. You can't be serious, he finally managed. This is about your feelings getting hurt? You're going to ruin your sister-in-law's wedding because you're throwing some kind of tantrum. That word, tantrum, hit me like a slap in the face. The same dismissive language Brooke had used in her text, the same condescending tone I'd been hearing from this family for years. Like my legitimate anger at being betrayed and humiliated was just some childish outburst that reasonable adults should ignore. I'm completely serious, I replied, my voice still steady as a rock. You decided I wasn't worthy of attending a wedding I paid for. I decided that if I'm not good enough to be a guest, then maybe this celebration shouldn't happen at all. But Grayson, Dennis pleaded, and now I could hear genuine desperation creeping into his voice. This will destroy Ava. She's been planning this for over a year. All our relatives are flying in from across the country. Should have thought about that before you cut me out, I said, and hung up. The phone immediately started ringing again, but this time it was Trevor. Dr. Trevor Morrison, the golden boy himself, probably calling to smooth things over with his charm and his medical degree and his natural assumption that everyone would just fall in line once he applied his considerable people skills to the situation. Grayson, man, I don't know what happened between you and the family, but we really need to fix this, he said the moment I picked up. His voice had that careful, measured tone doctors use when they're trying to calm down an agitated patient. I've got colleagues flying in from Chicago, my parents drove up from California yesterday, and Ava's cousins are already at the hotel. We can work through whatever this is, but we need the wedding to happen. Not my concern, Trevor, I said, and I meant it. For all his faults, Trevor had never been actively disrespectful to me. He'd just been oblivious to how his golden boy status made everyone else in the family feel invisible. But right now, I was past caring about collateral damage. Look, I get that you're upset about something, but surely we can find a compromise here. What's it going to take to make this right? Wait, I said, genuinely curious now. Are you telling me you don't even know what your fiancée and her family did? They didn't bother to fill you in on their little plan? What plan? Grayson, I'm completely lost here. All I know is that our wedding is apparently canceled, and somehow you're involved. Despite everything, I almost felt sorry for the guy. Here he was, thinking he was marrying into a normal family with normal problems, completely unaware that his future in-laws had just declared war on the man who'd been quietly bankrolling their lifestyle for years. Ask your fiancée, I said. Ask her to explain why I got uninvited from a wedding I paid 50 grand for. Ask her why her family thought it was a good idea to keep my money while kicking me to the curb. Another pause, longer this time. When Trevor spoke again, his voice had changed, less doctor-patient calm, more genuine confusion and growing concern. You paid for the wedding? But I thought. Ava said her parents were handling most of the costs. Nope, that was me. $50,000, paid quietly because I thought I was helping family. Turns out I was just being played for a sucker. Jesus Christ, Trevor breathed. I had no idea. Grayson, if this is true, then what they did is completely inexcusable. But please, man, Ava doesn't deserve to pay for her family's stupidity. She's been dreaming about this day since she was a little girl. Then maybe she should have married into a family that knows how to treat people with basic human decency. I replied. Wait, hold on. Are you seriously telling me that you actually own all the vendors? The venue, the catering, all of it? Check the contracts, Trevor. They all trace back to companies I own. Your beautiful wedding venue? Mine. The 5-star catering you've been bragging about? Mine. The hotel where all your guests are staying? Also mine. The silence stretched so long I thought the call might have dropped. Then Trevor let out a long, shaky breath. Holy shit, Grayson. You're not just some guy who runs a small business, are you? Not even close, I said, and for the first time all day, I allowed myself to smile. The calls kept coming like waves crashing against a seawall, each one more desperate than the last. I turned my phone to silent, but I could see it lighting up every few minutes with different numbers. Dennis calling back, Lorraine sobbing into voicemails, Ava's number flashing repeatedly like a distress signal. But it was Isla who called back first, her voice now carrying the kind of professional panic that told me she'd spent the last hour making phone calls that had systematically destroyed her faith in the wedding industry. Mr. Harland, she said, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. I've been making calls for the past 2 hours, and I'm afraid I have some rather devastating news for the Henderson-Morrison families. I leaned back in my chair, watching the afternoon sunlight filter through my office windows. Down below, Seattle was going about its business, completely unaware that somewhere in the city, 2 families were learning a very expensive lesson about burning bridges with the wrong person. Let me guess, I said, not bothering to hide my amusement. You can't find replacement vendors for their date. It's worse than that, sir. There's literally nothing available in the entire Pacific Northwest region for their wedding date. I've called every venue within a 300-mile radius, every catering company, every florist, every photographer. The few places that even have availability are either completely inappropriate for a wedding of this scale, or... She paused, and I could hear papers rustling. Well, they're also owned by companies that trace back to your holdings. That made me laugh. Actually laugh out loud. In all my years of building Kingsley Group, I'd never quite realized just how much of the regional hospitality market I'd managed to corner. It hadn't been intentional, just good business sense. When you see a profitable company in your industry struggling with debt or management issues, you buy it. When you find a property with potential that the current owners are mismanaging, you acquire it. Do that consistently for 15 years, and apparently you end up owning most of the wedding infrastructure in 3 states. What about out of state? I asked, genuinely curious about how far they'd be willing to go to avoid dealing with me directly. I tried California, Oregon, even as far south as Nevada. The problem is the timeline. We're talking about a wedding that's supposed to happen in 3 weeks. Most quality venues are booked a year in advance, and the ones that do have last-minute availability are. She trailed off diplomatically. Or what, Isla? Don't spare my feelings. Are not the kind of places where Dr. Morrison's colleagues would expect to attend a wedding, she said carefully. We're talking about VFW halls, community centers, maybe a few restaurants that could clear out their dining rooms. Nothing that would accommodate 120 guests with the level of service and elegance that was originally planned. I could picture it now. Trevor trying to explain to his fancy doctor friends why they were eating rubber chicken in a Knights of Columbus hall instead of the 5-star lakefront celebration they'd been promised. The thought was almost too delicious to bear. Even more problematic, Isla continued, is the fact that all the guests have already made travel arrangements. Flights, hotel reservations, rental cars. Most of these people took time off work, arranged childcare, spent money they can't get back. If we relocate the wedding to a different state or even a different city, we're essentially asking them to start over with their travel plans. And how are the families taking this news? I asked, though I had a pretty good idea based on the 17 missed calls on my phone. Not well, she said with what might have been the understatement of the year. Mrs. Whitmore has been crying for the past hour. Ava locked herself in her room and won't come out. Mr. Whitmore has been making increasingly frantic calls to every contact he has in the hospitality industry, trying to call in favors that apparently don't exist. I felt a small pang of something that might have been guilt, but it passed quickly when I remembered Brooke's text about keeping my money and talking when I'd calmed down. Sometimes the only way to make people understand the value of something is to take it away from them. And Dr. Morrison? I asked. He's been trying to manage the situation, making calls to his colleagues to explain the delay, attempting to negotiate with vendors directly. But sir, she hesitated, he also asked me to give you a message. Oh, this should be good. He wanted me to tell you that he had no knowledge of your removal from the guest list, and that he considers what his fiancé's family did to be completely unacceptable. He asked if there might be some way to resolve this situation that wouldn't punish Ava for her family's poor judgment. Interesting. So Trevor was trying to play peacemaker, positioning himself as the reasonable voice caught in the middle of a family drama he didn't create. I had to give him credit. It was a smart play, and honestly, it was probably the truth. The guy might be a little full of himself, but he'd never struck me as malicious. Did he now? I said. And what did you tell him? I told him that any resolution would have to come directly from you, and that my job was simply to coordinate services, not negotiate family disputes. Smart woman. She was learning to stay in her lane, which was probably a survival skill in her line of work. Isla, I said, making a decision that surprised even me. Tell the families that there is one option available to them. Just one. I could hear her scrambling for a pen. Yes, sir, what would that be? There's a property called Willow Fern Lodge about 40 minutes outside the city. It's smaller than what they originally planned. Rustic charm, mountain views, that sort of thing. It could work for their date. Oh, thank God, she breathed. I'll call them immediately, and... Isla, I interrupted gently. Yes, sir. That's one of mine, too. The silence that followed was so profound I wondered if she'd hung up on me. Mr. Harland, she finally whispered, exactly how much of the hospitality industry in this region do you own? I smiled, watching a cloud drift past my office window. More than enough. The desperation in Isla's voice was almost palpable through the phone line, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't enjoying every second of it. Not because I took pleasure in her suffering. She was just doing her job, after all, but because her panic was a direct reflection of the chaos that Brooke and her family were experiencing right about now. The same people who'd spent years making me feel like an afterthought were finally getting a taste of what it felt like to be powerless. Mr. Harland, Isla said, her voice barely above a whisper, I don't know what to tell these families anymore. I've exhausted every option I can think of. Is there truly no way to make this work? I let the silence stretch for a moment, savoring the weight of absolute control. In the business world, this was the moment I lived for, when the other party finally understood that all their options led through me, that I held all the cards and they were completely at my mercy. It was intoxicating in a way that most people would never understand. Actually, Isla, I said slowly, there is one path forward. But it's going to require the families to make some very difficult decisions. I could hear her intake of breath, the sound of someone grasping at a lifeline. Anything, sir? At this point, I think they'd agree to almost any terms. Almost any terms, I repeated, chuckling softly. We'll see about that. I stood up and walked over to my window, looking down at the city that had taught me everything I knew about power dynamics and negotiation. Sometimes the best deals were the ones where you didn't just win. You made sure everyone else understood exactly why they'd lost. Here's what I'm prepared to offer, I said, my voice taking on the crisp, authoritative tone I used in boardroom acquisitions. I'll make Pinebrook Pavilion available for their date. It's one of my smaller properties, about an hour outside the city, but it has its charm. Mountain views, rustic elegance, that whole organic aesthetic that's so popular these days. That sounds wonderful, Isla said, relief flooding her voice. What would be the— I'm not finished, I interrupted. The guest list will be capped at 60 people. Not negotiable. The venue simply can't accommodate the original 120, and frankly, after the way I've been treated, I'm not inclined to make special arrangements. I could hear her scribbling notes frantically. 60 guests, understood. And the catering arrangements. House menu only. No special requests. No dietary accommodations beyond basic vegetarian options. No custom cocktails. They'll get what I'm willing to provide, and they'll be grateful for it. Of course, sir. And the other services? Simple floral package, seasonal arrangements, nothing exotic or imported. One staff photographer for basic coverage, no elaborate photo shoots or artistic nonsense. The whole thing will be functional and dignified, but it won't be the fairy tale celebration they originally envisioned. I paused, letting her absorb the reality of what I was offering. This wasn't going to be the Instagram-worthy extravaganza that Ava had been planning for months. This was going to be a nice, modest wedding that would serve as a constant reminder of what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you. And the price? Isla asked, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected this was where the other shoe would drop. $180,000, I said calmly, as if I was discussing the weather instead of demanding 4 times what the original wedding had cost. Payable in full, in advance, before any services are rendered. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. When Isla finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Sir, that's 4 times what the original wedding cost. Even accounting for the last-minute arrangements and the premium for short notice, that seems excessive, I suggested. Unreasonable, maybe even vindictive. I wasn't going to say vindictive, she said quickly. But you were thinking it, I replied. And you know what? You're absolutely right. It is vindictive. It's also the price of burning bridges with the man who was holding them up in the first place. I could hear voices in the background, probably the families gathered around Isla's desk, hanging on every word of our conversation like their lives depended on it. Which, in a way, they did. But that's not all. I continued, savoring the moment like a fine wine. The price is contingent on 2 additional conditions that are completely non-negotiable. What conditions? Isla asked, though she sounded like someone asking about the terms of their own execution. First, my invitation to the wedding must be reinstated. Not grudgingly, not as an afterthought, but with a formal, written apology from Brooke and her parents acknowledging that their treatment of me was unacceptable. And the second condition? I smiled, even though she couldn't see it. The apology has to be read aloud during the reception, in front of all 60 guests, so everyone understands exactly why this wedding nearly didn't happen. The gasp that came through the phone was audible even over the background chaos. Someone, probably Lorraine, let out what sounded like a wounded animal cry. Mr. Harland, Isla said carefully, I understand that you're hurt and angry, but asking them to publicly humiliate themselves at their daughter's wedding seems like exactly the kind of public humiliation they were planning to put me through, I finished. The only difference is that now they understand what it feels like to be on the receiving end. I walked back to my desk and sat down, feeling more in control than I had in years. Those are my terms, Isla. $180,000, a formal written apology, and a public acknowledgement of their mistakes. They have 24 hours to decide. After that, the offer expires and they can explain to their relatives why there's no wedding at all. And if they refuse, then Ava can get married at the courthouse like millions of other people do every year. It might not be the fairy tale she dreamed of, but it'll be a lot cheaper than learning the hard way that actions have consequences. 2 days later, I was sitting in the main conference room at Kingsley Hall, my company's private estate that I rarely used for anything other than high-stakes business meetings. The room was designed to intimidate. 20-foot ceilings, oil paintings of Seattle's founding fathers, and a mahogany table that had probably cost more than most people's cars. If Brooks' family wanted to negotiate, they were going to do it on my turf, surrounded by reminders of exactly who they were dealing with. I'd chosen my outfit carefully that morning. A charcoal Tom Ford suit that fit like it had been painted on, Italian leather shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and a Patek Philippe watch that I'd bought to celebrate my first billion-dollar acquisition. Not because I needed to impress them, that ship had sailed, but because I wanted them to see, maybe for the first time, who I really was when I wasn't playing the role of the quiet, accommodating family member. They filed in like condemned prisoners approaching the gallows. Brooke came first, looking pale and nervous in a way I hadn't seen since our early dating days. Her usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by the uncertain posture of someone who'd finally realized they'd been playing a game with rules they didn't understand. Behind her came Ava and Trevor, followed by Dennis and Lorraine bringing up the rear like reluctant participants in their own intervention. The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. These were the same people who'd spent years talking over me at dinner tables, dismissing my opinions, treating me like furniture that they'd grown accustomed to ignoring. Now they sat in my conference room, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and power they'd never bothered to notice, finally understanding that the quiet guy they'd been overlooking was actually the one holding all the cards. Lorraine looked like she'd been crying for days, her mascara slightly smudged despite obvious attempts to repair it. Dennis kept fidgeting with his tie, a nervous habit I'd observed during family dinners when he was uncomfortable. Ava sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the table like she was trying to will herself invisible. I let the silence stretch for a full minute before speaking, enjoying the way they all tensed when I finally opened my mouth. "I'm here because I value family," I said, my voice carrying the calm authority that had served me well in countless negotiations. Even when family seems to forget my value. The words hung in the air like an accusation, which is exactly what they were meant to be. I watched as shame flickered across their faces, the uncomfortable recognition of their own behavior reflected back at them. Ava was the first to break, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grayson, I didn't know. I swear to God, I had no idea you were the one who paid for everything, or that you owned all the venues. If I'd known, you'd have what?" I asked, not unkindly, but not letting her off the hook either. "Treated me with basic human decency? Insisted that the man who bankrolled your wedding deserved an invitation to attend it." Brooke shifted uncomfortably in her chair, finally finding her voice. "Gray, I thought you'd understand. I was trying to avoid family drama, keep things simple. Understand being humiliated and used." I interrupted, my tone still calm, but with an edge that made everyone in the room freeze. "Understand having my generosity thrown back in my face while you kept my money? No, Brooke, I don't understand that at all." The room fell silent again, but this time it felt different. Instead of the arrogant dismissal I'd grown accustomed to from this family, there was something that looked suspiciously like genuine remorse. Then Trevor did something that surprised me. He stood up slowly, his face serious, and looked me directly in the eye. "Grayson," he said, his voice steady and sincere, "I want to apologize. Not just for myself, but for all of us. What Brooke and her family did was completely wrong, and there's no excuse for it." He paused, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "I'd be honored if you came to our wedding, not as some obligation or because you paid for it, but as a guest, and as a man I now deeply respect." The room went completely quiet. For the first time since this whole mess started, someone in Brooke's family was actually listening to me instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. And despite everything that had happened, despite the betrayal and the humiliation and the casual cruelty they'd shown me, I felt something shift in my chest. Maybe it was respect for Trevor's honesty, or maybe it was just exhaustion from carrying all this anger around for the past few days. For the first time in years, they were actually treating me like I mattered. They accepted my offer. All of it. The $180,000, paid in full by Dennis with what I suspected was a significant chunk of his retirement savings and a second mortgage on their house. The formal written apology, signed by Brooke and her parents in language that left no doubt about how badly they'd screwed up, and the public acknowledgement, which they agreed to with the kind of resigned acceptance that comes from knowing you've burned every other bridge available to you. 3 weeks later, I found myself standing in the main hall of Pinebrook Pavilion, watching as the final touches were put on what had become a surprisingly elegant celebration. The venue was smaller than what they'd originally planned, sure, but the mountain views were spectacular, and the rustic charm of the exposed beams and stone fireplace gave the whole thing a warmth that the original lakefront estate might have lacked. 60 guests instead of 120, but every person in that room understood they were witnessing something special. Word had gotten out, as word always does in situations like this, about the drama that had nearly canceled the wedding entirely. The story had been sanitized in the retelling, of course, but the basic facts were clear. Grayson Harland, the quiet guy everyone had underestimated, had turned out to be the puppet master pulling all the strings. I stood at my assigned table, wearing another perfectly tailored suit and watching as people I'd known for years looked at me with a mixture of respect, curiosity, and what might have been a healthy dose of fear. The same relatives who'd always greeted me with polite but dismissive small talk were now approaching me with the kind of deference usually reserved for minor celebrities or visiting dignitaries. "Grayson," Brooke's Uncle Mike had said during cocktail hour, "I had no idea you were in the hospitality business. Dennis mentioned you own quite a few properties around here." "A few," I'd replied with the kind of understatement that was becoming my signature response to these conversations. The ceremony itself had been beautiful in its simplicity. Ava looked stunning in her dress, her earlier tears replaced by genuine joy as she exchanged vows with Trevor. The groom, to his credit, had handled the entire situation with more grace than I'd expected, treating me with the kind of respect that made me think he might actually be worthy of joining this family. But it was during the reception that the real moment of reckoning came. Trevor stood up during the toasts, champagne glass in hand, and looked out over the assembled guests with the confidence of a man who'd made peace with an uncomfortable truth. The room fell silent as he began to speak, his voice carrying clearly in the intimate space. "Before we continue with the celebration," he said, "I want to take a moment to thank someone who made this day possible in ways that most of you probably don't fully understand." I felt every eye in the room turned toward me, and for a moment, I was transported back to all those family dinners where I'd been the invisible man at the end of the table. Except this time, instead of being ignored, I was the center of attention. "To Grayson Harland," Trevor continued, raising his glass higher. "The man who reminded us all not to mistake humility for weakness. You didn't just build this wedding. You rebuilt this family's integrity." The applause that followed was genuine, not the polite golf claps I'd grown accustomed to at family gatherings. Even Lorraine, who'd barely been able to look at me during the ceremony, wiped away a tear as she joined in. Ava stood up from the head table, her eyes bright with emotion. "Grayson," she said, her voice carrying across the room, "I owe you an apology that I should have given you years ago. You've been nothing but generous and kind to our family, and we repaid that kindness with disrespect and betrayal. I'm sorry, and I'm grateful, not just for what you did to save my wedding, but for the lesson you taught us about treating people with the respect they deserve." The room erupted in applause again, but this time it felt different. This wasn't just polite acknowledgement. This was recognition. For the first time in 7 years of being part of this family, they were actually seeing me for who I was instead of who they assumed I must be. Brooke had remained silent throughout the toasts, but as the evening wore on, I caught her watching me from across the room with an expression I couldn't quite read. When the dancing started and people began to mingle, she finally approached me, a glass of wine in her hand and something that looked like genuine remorse in her eyes. "I didn't know you were this powerful," she whispered, standing close enough that I could smell her perfume, the same scent she'd worn on our first date 9 years ago. I looked at her for a long moment, this woman I'd loved for nearly a decade, and felt something that might have been sadness. "You never asked," I replied softly, and walked away to join the celebration of a family that had finally learned to see me clearly. The morning after the wedding, I woke up in my penthouse apartment to the sound of rain pattering against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Seattle was doing what Seattle does best, washing yesterday's drama away with a steady downpour that made the city look clean and new. I'd barely finished my first cup of coffee when I heard Brooke's key turning in the lock, followed by the familiar sound of her heels clicking across the hardwood floors. She appeared in the kitchen doorway looking like she hadn't slept much, still wearing yesterday's makeup and the kind of expression that told me she'd spent the night rehearsing whatever speech she was about to deliver. In her hand was a bouquet of flowers, expensive ones, the kind you get from a real florist instead of the grocery store. And her eyes had that desperate brightness that meant she was operating on pure adrenaline and hope. "Gray," she said, setting the flowers on the granite countertop like a peace offering. "We need to talk. About us. About what happened. About what comes next." I took another sip of my coffee and looked at her over the rim of my mug. This woman who'd shared my bed for 7 years, who'd cried in my arms about her family's financial problems, who'd systematically erased me from one of the most important celebrations in her sister's life. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of finally understanding who she'd been married to all this time. "Maybe we can work on us," she continued, her voice carrying that tentative hope that people use when they're trying to rebuild something they've accidentally destroyed. "I know I messed up, Gray. I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry. But we've been together for 7 years. That has to count for something, right?" I set my coffee mug down on the marble counter, the small clink echoing in the sudden silence. Behind her, through the kitchen window, I could see my Tesla Model S Plaid parked in the building's private garage, the luggage already loaded in the back. I'd packed it the night before, while she was still at the wedding reception, probably networking with the same people who'd spent years treating me like furniture. "Brooke," I said quietly, "you weren't just silent during the betrayal. You planned it." The words hit her like a physical blow, and I watched as her face crumpled with the realization that there was no walking back from what she'd done. She'd orchestrated my humiliation, coordinated with her family to cut me out of a celebration I'd bankrolled, and then had the audacity to text me about keeping my money and talking when I'd calmed down. "But Gray," I was trying to avoid drama. "By creating drama," I interrupted, standing up from the kitchen island. "By lying to me, manipulating me, and treating me like a checkbook with legs instead of like your husband." I walked past her toward the hallway, where my overnight bag was already waiting by the door. 7 years of marriage, and it was amazing how little I actually needed to take with me. Most of the important stuff, the real estate holdings, the business interests, the bank accounts that actually mattered, those were all in my name anyway. "Where are you going?" she asked, following me with the kind of panic that meant she was finally understanding that apologies and flowers weren't going to fix this. "Away," I said simply, picking up my bag. "I'm done, Brooke. With you, with your family, with pretending that being treated like garbage is somehow normal in a marriage." I could hear her starting to cry behind me, but the sound didn't move me the way it used to. There's something about betrayal that burns away your capacity for misplaced sympathy, that teaches you the difference between genuine emotion and manipulative tears. My phone buzzed as I reached for the door handle. A text from Trevor, sent late last night after the reception had ended, a photo of him and Ava cutting the cake, both of them laughing with pure, unguarded joy. Below the image, he'd written, "Thank you. You were the Real foundation of this celebration." I smiled and typed back, "Remember that. Never bite the hand that builds your world." His response came immediately. "Lesson learned. Travel safe, and thank you for teaching us what real strength looks like." I pocketed the phone and opened the door, stepping out into the hallway that led to the elevator, to the parking garage, to whatever came next. Behind me, I could hear Brooke calling my name, her voice echoing off the walls with the desperation of someone who'd finally realized what she'd lost. But I didn't look back. I'd spent 7 years looking back, making excuses, accepting scraps of respect from people who should have treasured what I brought to their lives. Now I was looking forward, toward a horizon that didn't include people who mistook kindness for weakness. The elevator doors closed with a soft whisper, carrying me down toward ground level and a new beginning. Not as the uninvited husband, not as the family ATM, not as the quiet guy who could be safely ignored, but as the man who'd reminded them all that silent doesn't mean weak. Silent means watching. And when silent men finally move, the ground shakes beneath everyone who underestimated them.